1988, when Princess Diana met Roger Rabbit at a film premiere, creating a surreal photograph that captured how British royalty was adapting to modern celebrity culture by engaging with Hollywood entertainment rather than maintaining rigid traditional distance, showing Diana's genuine warmth and ability to break stuffy royal protocol by treating a cartoon character with the same gracious attention she gave heads of state, representing a transformation in how monarchies related to popular culture and foreshadowing the complete merger of royalty and entertainment celebrity that defines the institution today. December 1954 at Windsong Estate in Palm Beach, when Lulu and her husband embodied the casual elegance of post-war American wealth, posing barefoot against their red car in a photograph that captures the unique moment when prosperity created a new upper class that mixed European sophistication with distinctly American informality, representing the brief 1950s era when the wealthy cultivated understated luxury rather than ostentatious display, existing in a sweet spot between Depression-era austerity and the conspicuous consumption that would define later decades as this generation of business executives and socialites created a lifestyle aesthetic that felt both aspirational and somehow achievable to the expanding middle class watching from afar. San Francisco, 1928, when this DeSoto 6 sedan represented the American dream of mobility and freedom as automobiles transitioned from rich people's toys to middle-class necessities that would fundamentally reshape society by enabling suburban sprawl, transforming courtship rituals, and creating the road trip culture that defined American identity, capturing the optimistic pre-Depression moment when car ownership seemed within reach for ordinary families and promised social advancement through mechanical progress, just before the economic collapse would devastate automakers like DeSoto and reveal that the prosperity enabling mass car ownership was more fragile than anyone imagined. Washington, 1919, when a Salvation Army volunteer brings hot coffee to a police officer on a freezing street, capturing the charitable networks that sustained working people in an era before government social programs or labor protections addressed basic needs like warmth and rest during long outdoor shifts, representing how military-style charitable organizations gained enormous public credibility through World War I service and brought those support systems home to American communities, filling crucial gaps in a transitional moment between the complete absence of social services and the New Deal programs that would eventually make government responsible for worker welfare that private charity couldn't adequately provide. Washington, 1913, when thousands of suffragettes marched demanding voting rights in a demonstration that accelerated the movement winning women the vote 7 years later, capturing the moment when respectable middle-class women became organized activists for political rights, representing decades of peaceful struggle required to achieve changes through courage and persistence that transformed democratic participation and expanded civil rights to half the population previously excluded from the political process. 1923, when federal agents publicly destroyed confiscated alcohol in dramatic displays meant to demonstrate government authority during Prohibition, creating images that revealed the policy's challenges as the banned trade continued despite enforcement efforts, capturing the era when constitutional amendment criminalized previously legal behavior, representing how ambitious social policies require public support to succeed and demonstrating the complex relationship between legislation and social customs in democratic societies. 1911, when photographer Lewis Hine documented young factory workers in textile mills, creating images that helped fuel the reform movement, establishing child labor laws and compulsory education, capturing children working long shifts for minimal pay in industrial conditions, representing how social reform photography exposed labor practices that eventually led to legal protections requiring education for children and establishing workplace standards that transformed industrial society and created the childhood we now consider normal. Berlin, 1948. When Western pilots flew supplies around the clock for nearly a year to sustain West Berlin during the blockade, delivering food and fuel that kept 2 million people alive, capturing the moment when former adversaries became partners in a dramatic humanitarian effort that defined early Cold War dynamics, representing how the massive airlift became both relief mission and demonstration of commitment that established new alliances and illustrated the complete transformation of international relationships in the post-war world. 1939, when the first commercial transatlantic flight carried passengers from New York to Europe in luxury that cost more than most people's annual salary, transforming ocean crossings from 5-day ship voyages into 18-hour flights for the wealthy elite, capturing the excitement of travelers experiencing technology that would eventually democratize international travel, but initially served only the privileged few, representing aviation's transition from experimental adventure to commercial service that would fundamentally reshape global connectivity and make international travel accessible to millions within just a few decades. New York, November 1942, when nursing students learned that toys and play were essential therapeutic tools rather than mere distractions, representing the revolutionary shift in pediatric medicine that recognized childhood emotional needs as integral to physical healing and transformed hospital treatment from purely clinical to holistic care, capturing wartime America, investing in progressive healthcare training that acknowledged psychological trauma and pioneered child-centered medical approaches that would eventually become standard practice, demonstrating how even during global conflict, medical professionals advanced understanding of healing beyond just physical interventions to embrace comprehensive care, addressing the whole patient. Atlantic City, circa 1905, when lifeguards became essential as beaches transformed from dangerous natural spaces into popular recreational destinations filled with Victorian bathers in full coverage costumes who often couldn't swim, representing the professionalization of safety at resorts where drowning was common because swimming ability was rare among the middle-class crowds seeking fashionable seaside leisure, capturing the moment when managed recreation required trained professionals protecting visitors who lacked survival skills but increasingly demanded access to water activities, demonstrating how modern beach culture requiring lifeguards emerged from the collision between growing leisure time and inadequate water safety education. November 1961, when Sophia Loren posed for Look magazine, embodying the European glamour and unapologetic sensuality that challenged Hollywood's blonde American beauty standards and made her an international icon, representing early 1960s sophistication when post-war prosperity allowed mass audiences to consume luxury imagery through magazines that brought elite fashion into middle-class homes, capturing the moment when European stars offered alternative aesthetic that mixed old-world elegance with modern boldness, and demonstrated that beauty standards could expand beyond the narrow definitions Hollywood had promoted, democratizing access to glamorous imagery while maintaining its aspirational quality that made readers both admire and desire the lifestyle these photographs suggested was possible. 1943. When millions of women entered factories and shipyards performing skilled industrial labor previously reserved exclusively for men, welding ships and building aircraft that would win the war while proving female capability in traditionally male professions, representing the massive but temporary expansion of women's economic opportunities that demonstrated competence. Authorities had always denied, but would try to reverse once soldiers returned home, capturing the paradox of wartime emergency, creating progressive social change that peacetime society would resist maintaining, despite evidence that gender restrictions on labor were arbitrary rather than natural. 1950, when pioneering African American students integrated previously all-white universities, enduring social isolation and hostility while pursuing education that would eventually open professional opportunities their parents never accessed, representing the early phase of educational desegregation that happened through individual courage, years before Brown versus Board of Education would legally mandate integration, capturing the psychological costs paid by students who served as test cases for equality, while white classmates often refused basic social interaction, demonstrating that legal rights alone don't create acceptance, and that genuine integration requires cultural transformation beyond what courts can mandate. 1925, when telephone operators manually connected every call through complex switchboards requiring speed and precision, creating one of the first mass employment opportunities for young women in technical work that paid better than domestic service or factory labor, representing the brief moment when telecommunications companies hired thousands of educated women for skilled positions before automation would eliminate these jobs and the advancement opportunities they represented, capturing female workers performing technical labor that contradicted claims about women's unsuitability for complex cognitive tasks, while maintaining strict rules about appearance and behavior that reinforce gender expectations even in progressive workplaces. 1938, when big band jazz represented the height of American popular music and African American musicians created sophisticated art that white audiences consumed while maintaining racial segregation in most venues, capturing the cultural contradiction where black artistic innovation drove mainstream entertainment industry, but performers often couldn't stay in hotels where they performed or eat in restaurants near their concert halls, representing how cultural influence doesn't automatically translate to social equality, and demonstrating that white America eagerly appropriated black musical creativity while denying basic civil rights to the people who created it. 1936, when Dust Bowl and economic collapse forced hundreds of thousands of farm families onto roads seeking any work available, traveling to California and other states where they faced hostility and exploitation as desperate labor competing for scarce jobs, representing the massive internal migration that exposed how quickly American prosperity could collapse into poverty, and revealed that hard work alone couldn't guarantee survival when environmental disaster and economic systems failed simultaneously, capturing families who lost everything through circumstances beyond their control, yet were blamed for their own destitution by communities that feared the poor would drain local resources. 1964, when integrated college cafeterias showed genuine social mixing across racial lines that civil rights legislation made possible but couldn't mandate, representing the quiet everyday moments of integration that mattered more than dramatic protests in actually transforming American social relationships, capturing young people navigating newly desegregated spaces and choosing to sit together despite centuries of enforced separation, demonstrating that legal equality creates opportunities for human connection, but actual integration requires individuals willing to overcome inherited prejudices and social pressure to maintain racial boundaries their parents considered natural and necessary. 1918, when American cities began hiring female police officers primarily to work with women and children in roles authorities claimed required feminine compassion rather than law enforcement capability, representing the limited way women entered male-dominated professions through carving separate spheres rather than competing directly for existing positions. Capturing the paradox where professional opportunities for women expanded, but within frameworks that reinforce gender stereotypes about natural feminine qualities. Demonstrating that breaking barriers often requires accepting compromises that limit how far change can actually go, while establishing precedents that later generations would use to demand fuller equality. 1945, when millions of soldiers returned from World War II to families and country transformed by their absence, coming home to children who barely remembered them and wives who had managed independently for years, representing the massive social readjustment required as servicemen reclaimed civilian identities and family roles while struggling with experiences they couldn't explain to people who hadn't shared them. Capturing the joy of reunion that photographs emphasized while leaving invisible the difficult psychological transitions and family tensions that many veterans faced in a society that expected them to simply resume normal life as if war hadn't changed them fundamentally. 1952, when massive government investment in university research following World War II and during the Cold War transformed American higher education from primarily teaching institutions into research powerhouses driving technological innovation, representing the moment when federal funding created the modern research university system and made scientific careers viable for talented students who previously would have entered different professions, capturing the optimistic faith in science and expertise that characterized the early Cold War before Vietnam and other controversies would erode public trust in academic authority and reveal that scientific progress doesn't automatically serve democratic values. Ellis Island, 1907, when immigrants underwent medical inspections that could result in deportation after traveling thousands of miles seeking American opportunity, facing officials who held arbitrary power to separate families and deny entry based on perceived health or economic viability, representing America's complicated relationship with immigration that simultaneously celebrated itself as refuge for the world's oppressed while implementing strict controls to exclude those deemed undesirable, capturing the anxiety of people who risked everything for the promise of better lives, but discovered that welcome came with conditions and that American dream had gatekeepers enforcing standards about who deserved access to opportunity the nation claimed to offer universally. New England circa 1910, when bathers wore heavy full coverage costumes that absorbed water and restricted movement, making actual swimming nearly impossible, but satisfying modesty standards that considered exposed skin morally dangerous, representing the era when beaches transformed from exclusive resorts into democratized leisure spaces for working and middle classes seeking recreation, despite impractical clothing requirements, capturing the tension between Victorian propriety and growing demand for water activities that would eventually force society to choose between maintaining strict modesty codes and allowing people to actually enjoy swimming safely, demonstrating how cultural anxieties about bodies initially trumped practical concerns until drowning deaths and changing attitudes finally permitted less restrictive swimwear. 1895, when bicycles gave women unprecedented independent mobility and sparked fierce debate about proper feminine behaviour, as cycling required less restrictive clothing and unsupervised travel that conservatives claimed would destroy moral standards, representing how technology can accidentally advance social liberation when inventions designed for recreation create practical arguments against traditional restrictions, capturing women who embrace cycling despite criticism and gradually force society to accept that female independence and physical activity wouldn't actually cause civilizational collapse, demonstrating that progress often comes through mundane technological adoption rather than direct political confrontation, as practical needs slowly erode ideological restrictions. 1932, when unemployment drove trained musicians to street corners hoping passers-by would spare coins for performances that once earned professional wages, representing how economic collapse eliminated not just factory jobs, but cultural employment as theatres closed and orchestras disbanded, capturing artists trying to survive through their skills in a society where most people had no spare money for entertainment and desperation, made dignity a luxury few could afford, demonstrating that depression destroyed more than material prosperity by forcing talented people into situations that previous generations would have considered beneath professional standards, but that became necessary when all alternatives disappeared. Europe 1946, when children grew up playing in bombed ruins that became their normal landscape, creating games among rubble and treating destruction as playground because they knew nothing else, representing the generation that experienced war's aftermath as ordinary childhood rather than trauma, and whose resilience helps societies rebuild despite material devastation, capturing how humans adapt to catastrophic circumstances by normalizing them, and how children particularly find ways to create joy even in environments adults recognize as tragedy, demonstrating that recovery from war requires not just physical reconstruction, but psychological adjustment as populations learn to function in transformed worlds. 1948, when television was so new and expensive that crowds gathered outside store windows to watch programming through glass, mesmerized by technology that would within a decade become common household appliance, transforming American culture completely, representing the brief moment when TV was communal public experience rather than private entertainment, and when moving images in homes seemed almost magical to people who grew up with only radio, capturing the transition point before mass media would reshape politics, advertising, family life, and social interaction in ways these curious onlookers couldn't imagine as they watched the technology that would define the second half of the 20th century and create the information environment we still inhabit today.